All right. Hello, everyone. Hope we're doing well. So, today we're going to be talking about how the harm principle goes some way to justify the practice of informed consent in medical ethics and in medical practice. So, first things first, we're going to be talking about the harm principle. And you've already watched a video on this, so I'm going to go over this kind of quickly. But the idea with the harm principle is that the government is justified in exerting or exercising its powers of coercion, only if it prevents harm to other people, right? So, for instance, it's illegal to punch another person in the face. I can go to jail for that. According to the harm principle, that law is justified because that law prevents me from harming other people by punching them in the face, right? Um, there are other laws that would probably fall outside of the harm principle. So, for instance, consider motorcycle helmet laws. According to many places, it's illegal to drive a motorcycle without a helmet, right? But the idea with motorcycle helmet laws is that it's beneficial for you, the individual, to um, uh, wear a motorcycle helmet. However, you're not going to cause anybody else any harm by not wearing a helmet. So, according to the harm principle, motorcycle helmet laws are not quite right, are fall outside of the harm principle, right? And so they're unjustified. Okay, so we have a view like the harm principle. It's really important to understand this view because it's so common in American law today, even. A lot of judges and legislators buy this principle, right? Okay, so according to Mill, paternalism is false. So in our excerpt from the reading, he talks about paternalism and very quickly rejects it, right? But there are some scholars who debate about whether or not um, Mill adopts some form of paternalism. We won't go down that path too much, but it will be helpful to see and understand what paternalism is. So, what is paternalism? Paternalism is the view that the government is justified in exercising its powers, its coercive powers, only if it prevents harm to others or to oneself, right? So, for instance, consider again motorcycle helmet laws. According to paternalism, the government is justified in making it illegal to not wear your helmet. Well, why? The government's justified because it prevents harms that could occur to you, right? So it's not just about harming other people, it's also about activities that could harm yourself as well, right? And so the government is being like a parent here. It's kind of like how you would treat a child. Well, you don't want to, stick the fork in the outlet, right? Because that could harm you, and so we take the fork away from you. Similarly, the government can use its coercive powers to prevent harm to the individuals, right? Rather than the individuals harming other people. But there are two different kinds of paternalism that we should talk about. First is strong paternalism. According to strong paternalism, the government is justified in exercising its coercive powers only if it prevents harm to oneself or to another person. And when we're talking about harm to oneself, we're talking about reasons that the individual does not accept, right? So this is, we could imagine a religious extremist group, maybe say an Islamic extremist group, overtakes a government and then makes it law that all men have to have beards and all women have to, say, have facial coverings, right? Um, this is a form of paternalism. However, it's strong paternalism because not everybody is going to accept that those values are good for them, right? the idea here is that there is some form of paternalism that others think that it's not good for them, but the government coercively turns it into law regardless of individual views. Contrast this with weak paternalism, which says that the government is justified in exercising its powers only if it prevents harm to others or to oneself for reasons that the individual accepts, right? So, for instance, consider again motorcycle helmet laws. Okay, so when it comes to riding a motorcycle with no helmet, some people may enjoy that, right? But nobody wants to, say, get into an accident and have their brains splattered all over the side of the road. Nobody wants that, right? And so it seems like mandating motorcycle helmet laws falls into this category of weak paternalism, right? Because it's paternalistic because we're preventing harm to you, but we're preventing harm that you would accept if you thought about it, right? Or everybody, generally speaking, would accept those reasons. Whereas strong paternalism, we can't really say that everybody would accept those reasons, or say a rational person would accept those reasons. Okay, so the idea here is that we have sort of three views on the table: the harm principle view, strong paternalism, weak paternalism, right? And these views are going to influence the medical practice of informed consent, right? Okay. So what is informed consent? Informed consent is just very broadly a norm in medical practice that states that so long as a patient is of sound mind, she must consent to any procedure that occurs, right? So a patient needs to know the risks, needs to know the potential outcomes of a procedure or of a selection of procedures, and she has to be the one to make those decisions herself, right? We'll see in the next video that this is a relatively new principle, right? And medical ethics principles tended to be more about like, how can we coerce the person into like, or how can we prevent pain, right? All of these sorts of things. And there was very little emphasis on an individual's consent, right? Okay, good. So informed consent involves a rejection of paternalism, right? So the idea with the harm principle is that we all get the freedom sort of to decide what happens with our bodies, to decide what form of life we want, and we get to pursue whatever goods we decide are of value, right? So long as those goods don't pose harms or risks of harm to others. So the idea here is that a medical procedure, whether I undergo a medical procedure or not, is not going to harm anyone else. Rather, it's going to be beneficial or harmful to me. And so according to the harm principle, I get some say in whether I get to undergo some operation, right? I hope that's clear. And so if we assume paternalism, then we're going to say that potentially we're going to say that, look, patients don't get any real say in what goes into the procedure. They don't get any real say over whether they get to have a procedure or not, since the procedure is going to be good for them. Rather, we ought to coercively make them undergo various procedures or things because it's good for them, regardless of whether they want to. So, so a paternalist medical ethic would involve giving patients procedures that are for their good, but maybe that they don't necessarily consent to. So consider the following case. the descendant of an anti-vaxxer also chooses not to be vaccinated for MMR. During a very minor surgery, a physician administers the MMR vaccine without the patient's knowing, right? So we can, this is kind of a tricky case, right? So potentially after the operation, the patient would never know that they've been vaccinated for MMR. And so it may well be the case that they never will know, but still they've been benefited, as they will not get measles or mumps now, right? So a paternalist is going to say, or could argue, that this kind of practice is justified, right? Because it's good for the individual to have the MMR vaccine. Their consent doesn't matter, right? Whereas somebody who endorses the harm principle is going to say, no, since my having the vaccine isn't going to affect any other people, I get to choose what I do in the case, right? So we see that there's some tension between these two views, right? And so the proponent of informed consent is going to say that the paternalism here is not right, because the patient should have consented to the MMR vaccine. Okay, so what do we do here? So the harm principle and informed consent. So I've already sort of touched on this a little bit, but the harm principle says that we ought to pursue whatever form of life we choose, so long as that form of life does not harm other people, right? If I want to swing my arms every which way, I get to do that, right? But it stops just before I get to your chin, so because hitting you in the face would harm you, right? So according to the harm principle, a person should have some choice about whether they undergo an operation or medical procedure, so long as it does not pose harm to other people, right? And to force medical procedures on other people is paternalistic. That's kind of the idea here, which we've already talked about. So let's look at a slightly different case. Let's say that that when enough people deny vaccines, some diseases are going to reemerge, right? And if these diseases reemerge, let's say something like mumps, right? Let's suppose that if enough people stop taking the MMR vaccine, that mumps is going to return and kind of be like COVID, right? It will there will be new variants, and these new variants will affect, say, both people who are unvaccinated and people who are vaccinated, right? Such that we have to create new MMR vaccines and try and keep ahead of the virus. I think it's a virus. At any rate, let's suppose that if enough people don't take the MMR vaccine, then mumps is going to return, right? Okay, so it seems clear that there's going to be a potential harm that ensues from my decision not to take the MMR vaccine. So here's the question: does the harm principle justify a vaccine mandate in these circumstances, right? So my decision to not take the MMR vaccine maybe runs a risk, or it is likely to cause a situation that potentially harms other people. According to the harm principle, it seems, we could mandate and coerce free individuals to undergo vaccination, regardless of their will. And that's because of the harms that are posed against other people, right? And so we can kind of think about this in sort of the present day COVID-19 vaccines, right? We can think about this in a number of different situations. So anyway, so this is, in this video, we've talked about how the harm principle kind of gives rise to the practice of informed consent, and it kind of offers a theoretical justification for the practice and norm of informed consent. Okay, thanks.